The moment Harriet Bancroft stepped off the stagecoach in Coldwater Flats, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1883, every soul on the main street stopped what they were doing and stared at her like she had descended from a different planet entirely. She was 24 years old, and she had come alone from Philadelphia with 2 leather trunks, a sewing kit, a crate of books, and a confidence that had been mistaken for arrogance by people with lesser ambitions her entire life. Her dress was deep burgundy wool, too fine for the dust that immediately began coating her boots, and her dark hair was pinned up beneath a wide-brimmed hat that was both practical and beautiful at the same time. She looked at the town with clear, steady gray eyes that catalogued everything and dismissed nothing, and she set her trunks down on the boardwalk with a definitive thud that announced she was precisely where she intended to be. The man who approached her first was not the one she would come to love. He was Gideon Marsh, the land office clerk, a thin-shouldered man in his late 40s who had the expression of someone perpetually expecting bad weather. He removed his hat and told her that the Coldwater Hotel had a room available, and she thanked him politely and asked where she might find the office of the territorial surveyor. Gideon blinked. "Ma'am, the surveyor," she said. "I was told there was a land parcel becoming available on the eastern side of the valley, and I intend to file on it before anyone else does." Gideon looked at her the way men had looked at her in Philadelphia, in St. Louis, in Albuquerque, which was with a combination of bewilderment and the faint beginning of affront. "That parcel is rough country," he told her carefully. "No water on the surface, alkali soil in parts, and the closest neighbor is 3 miles east. It is no place for a woman traveling alone." "I did not ask for your assessment of the parcel," Harriet said pleasantly. "I asked where the surveyor's office was." She filed on the land the same afternoon. Word traveled quickly in a small territory town. By supper, every person in Coldwater Flats knew that a woman from Philadelphia had come west and claimed the Harlow parcel, the one people had been murmuring about since old Delbert Harlow died without heirs the previous autumn. By the time Harriet had eaten a quiet meal at the hotel dining room and gone upstairs to sleep away the exhaustion of her long journey, at least 3 separate conversations in the saloon were debating whether she would last a week. Wesley Abbott heard about her while he was watering his horses at the public trough on the edge of town, having ridden in from his own spread to pick up a supply order at Drummond's General Store. The man who told him was Pete Calloway, who ran the livery, and Pete told it like a man telling a joke whose punchline was still forming. "Pretty woman," Pete said, leaning on the post of the livery door. "Dressed like she belongs in a parlor somewhere. Came in on the noon stage and went straight to the land office. Filed on the Harlow parcel." Wesley said nothing for a moment. He was 30 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the way that came from actual work rather than inheritance, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown eyes that spent too much time squinting at distant horizons. He had built his own ranch, the Double A, from a single homestead claim 6 years ago, and he had done it through the kind of stubborn competence that made him more respected than liked in the valley, though the two things were beginning to converge as he got older. "The Harlow parcel," he repeated. "That same one," Pete said. "Gideon told me she didn't even blink when he mentioned the alkali, just asked for the surveyor." Wesley looked out across the flat towards the hills where the Harlow parcel sat behind a rise of scrubby juniper. He knew that land. He had considered filing on it himself the previous winter, but between managing the Double A's expanded cattle operation and navigating the water rights dispute with the Dunbar family 2 valleys over, he had let it sit. It was rough country. Good bones underneath if you knew how to work it, but the first year would be brutal even for an experienced homesteader. "She come alone?" he asked. "Alone as sunrise," Pete said. Wesley paid for his supplies and rode home with the particular unsettled feeling of a man who does not yet understand why he is unsettled. He met Harriet Bancroft properly 3 days later. She had hired Tom Lessing's mule and cart and driven herself out to the Harlow parcel to have a look at the land she had just claimed, and Wesley came across her standing in the middle of what would eventually become her front yard, which at that moment was a patch of dry, cracked earth bordered by a collapsed section of old stone wall, holding a compass in one hand and a notebook in the other, talking to herself in a low, focused murmur as she drew lines on the page. He pulled his horse up and watched her for a moment longer than was strictly polite, because there was something genuinely arresting about the sight of her, not just in the obvious sense but in the purposeful way she moved through that landscape, as though she had already decided in her mind what it was going to become and was simply measuring the distance between the present reality and that vision. She heard his horse and looked up. She did not startle. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," Wesley said. He swung down from the saddle, more out of manners than necessity. "Wesley Abbott. I run the AA east of the creek." "Harriet Bancroft," she said. "I run this parcel such as it currently is." She said it without humor but not without warmth, and he found himself smiling against his better judgment. "I heard you filed," he said. "And you came to have a look at the woman foolish enough to do it," she said, which was precisely accurate and therefore impossible to deny without lying, so he did not try. "I came to check my fence line along the south boundary," he said, which was also true, though he had been more deliberate about the timing than he would have admitted. "It runs about a quarter-mile south of where you're standing. You'll want to know that when you start working out your cattle range, if that's your intention." Intention is a kitchen garden, an apple orchard if the water situation can be resolved, and eventually a proper house, she said, as if these things were already done. "The cattle will come after." He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Bancroft, I don't mean any disrespect, but this territory has broken tougher homesteaders than you. The summers are brutal, the winters are worse, and the nearest working well that I know of is on my property." "Is there a price for the water?" she asked. He blinked. He had expected argument, or offense, or at least some performance of determination meant to convince him. He had not expected a practical question about resource access. "No price," he said before he had entirely decided to say it. "Neighbors share water out here. It is just the way things work." "Then I appreciate it," she said, and went back to her notebook. He stood there for another moment, hat in his hand, and the feeling that had unsettled him since Pete Calloway told him about her deepened into something he could not yet name. He put his hat back on and said, "There is a seasonal creek about 200 yards north of where you're standing. It runs dry by July most years, but it would give you surface water through spring. You might want to account for that in your planting." She looked up at him again, and this time the expression in her gray eyes shifted, just slightly, into something that might have been the beginning of surprise or the beginning of reassessment. "Thank you," she said. "That is genuinely useful." "This territory is no place for someone like you," he said, because he could not stop himself, the words coming out almost before he decided to speak them. She looked at him steadily for a moment, and then she said, "What kind of person do you think I am, Mr. Abbott?" He could not answer that adequately, because the truthful answer was that he did not yet know, which was the entire problem. He tipped his hat and rode south to check his fence line. Harriet spent 3 weeks at the Coldwater Hotel while she organized the work that needed to be done on the parcel, which was substantial. The previous owner had built a 2-room structure that was mostly still standing, which was the most generous way to describe it. The walls solid but the roof badly compromised and the single window lacking any glass. She hired a pair of brothers named Cobb and Silas Farmer, who did rough carpentry and general labor, to shore up the walls and replace the roof boards. She bought glass from Drummond's store and had it cut. She ordered seeds through the Territorial Supply Catalog, making her selections with the focused intensity of someone who had done considerable prior research. The women of Coldwater Flats were divided in their reaction to her. Agnes Drummond, who ran the general store with her husband Rufus, warmed to her almost immediately. Agnes was 53 and had been in the territory long enough to respect competence regardless of its source. She helped Harriet identify which seeds would actually grow in that soil and climate, which catalog entries were hopeful marketing rather than sound farming advice, and which local suppliers could be trusted for equipment versus which ones would sell a woman twice the hardware at twice the price. "You are going to have a hard first year," Agnes told her one afternoon, leaning on the counter while Harriet sorted through a crate of seed packets. "I know," Harriet said. "I mean genuinely hard," Agnes said. "Not the kind of hard where you push through and feel proud afterward. The kind where you question every decision you have made and cry into your pillow on a Tuesday." "I have already had that kind," Harriet said, and the way she said it made Agnes look at her more carefully, because it was clear she was not speaking hypothetically. Agnes set a hand briefly on Harriet's arm, said nothing, and that was the beginning of a friendship that would sustain Harriet through the whole first season. There were other women less welcoming. Mabel Drennan, who was married to the largest landowner in the valley, Earl Drennan, did not like what Harriet represented, which was the idea that a woman could simply arrive somewhere and begin building a life without a husband as the visible frame around the project. Mabel had constructed her own position in the valley through careful social architecture, and Harriet's presence was architecturally disruptive, introducing a kind of woman the social structure had not accounted for. "She will leave before winter," Mabel told anyone who would listen. "She does not understand what she has gotten into." This prediction, like most predictions made confidently about Harriet Bancroft, was wrong. Through May and into June, Harriet worked the parcel with the Cobb and Silas farmer brothers and increasingly on her own, and the valley watched. She planted a kitchen garden behind the house and marked out the orchard in the flat ground north of the creek bed, even though there was no apple tree growing there yet, just stakes and string indicating where they would eventually stand. She bought a small herd of 4 goats, which she managed herself with the sort of focused practicality that amused the ranchers nearby, and earned her grudging respect from the farm wives. She walked the boundary of her land every morning. She cataloged the soil in different sections, separating the good earth from the alkali patches. She took notes in her book about what the light did at different times of day, about where the wind came from in the afternoon, about the way the shadows moved across the hills to the west. People saw her doing this and did not quite know what to make of it, because it looked simultaneously eccentric and methodical. Wesley Abbott saw her doing it 3 separate times before the end of May. This was not an accident, though he told himself it was each of the first 2 times. He found reasons to ride the fence line along the southern boundary, which was a reasonable thing to do because it was his fence line. He found reasons to be at the public well on the days she came into town. He passed the parcel twice on his way back from checking on the eastern cattle range, though the direct route did not require him to pass through that stretch of country. The 3rd time he stopped properly and got off his horse. She was sitting on the stone wall near the northern edge of her property, writing in her notebook, and she looked up when she heard him coming and did not pretend she had not noticed him riding up. "Mr. Abbott," she said. "Miss Bancroft," he said, "your roof is done." "It is," she said. "Cobb Farmer does good work." "He does," Wesley agreed. He looked at the house, which was notably improved from its original state, the new boards clean and pale against the older weathered walls, the window glass catching the afternoon light. "You have done a good deal in a month." "Less than I had hoped," she said, "but more than most people expected." He sat down on the far end of the stone wall without being invited, which she did not seem to mind. She watched him do it with an expression of mild assessment that he was beginning to recognize as her default expression for him specifically. "What are you writing?" he asked. She considered whether to show him for a moment, then turned the notebook toward him. The pages were dense with observations, soil notes, temperature recordings, wind direction indicators, small precise sketches of the terrain at different points on the property. It was the work of someone who was trying to understand a place deeply before they committed to it, or perhaps, he thought, she had already committed and was now building the knowledge to match. "You kept temperature records," he said, because that genuinely surprised him. "Every morning and evening since I arrived," she said. "I need to know the actual range before I can plan properly. The information in the surveying reports is too general. I need to know this specific piece of ground." He handed the notebook back and looked out across her land with different eyes than he had used before. "You are serious about the orchard," he said. "I am serious about everything I do," she said. "Most people would start with cattle and a hay field." "I am not most people," she said without any particular pride in it, just as a statement of fact. "And I have been reading about high-altitude apple cultivation. New Mexico is higher than people think. The nights are cold enough. The growing season is shorter, but the fruit is better. I spoke to a man in Albuquerque who grows apples at roughly the same elevation, and he said his yield last autumn was the finest he had seen in 15 years of farming." Wesley looked at her. "You spoke to a farmer in Albuquerque about apple cultivation before you filed on this parcel." "I spent 4 months preparing before I came here," she said. "I read every territorial survey I could access in Philadelphia. I corresponded with the New Mexico Agricultural Society. I spoke to 3 homesteaders and a former Army surveyor. I did not come here on a whim." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. He had assumed, without fully articulating the assumption even to himself, that she had made an impulsive decision, a restless woman from a comfortable city making a romantic gesture toward the frontier that reality would quickly correct. This was wrong. He saw now that it was almost insultingly wrong, and the embarrassment of having thought it sat with him uncomfortably. "What brought you from Philadelphia?" he asked, because now he actually wanted to know. She looked at the hills to the west for a moment, the late afternoon light turning them amber. "I had a life there that belonged to other people's expectations," she said. "I was supposed to marry a man whose primary quality was that he had approved of me. I was supposed to run a household and attend the appropriate social engagements and be happy because happiness was something that was supposed to happen naturally if you followed the correct sequence of steps." She paused. "I tried it for 2 years. The engagement, the planning, and I could not make myself do it. Not because he was a bad man, but because the life itself was wrong. Not wrong in a grand sense, just wrong for me. And once I knew that, I had to go find what was right." "You ended an engagement," Wesley said. "Yes," she said, which was all she said, and he understood from her tone that it had not been simple or painless, that there had been considerable social wreckage involved, and that she had walked through it anyway. He looked at her for a long time without speaking, and she looked back at him with those steady gray eyes that did not need him to say anything in return. "The well is open to you whenever you need it," he said finally. "I know," she said. "You told me." "I just wanted to make sure you knew I meant it," he said. She smiled then, for the first time since he had sat down, and it changed her face in a way that made him understand all at once why every person in Coldwater Flats had an opinion about Harriet Bancroft, because she was, when she smiled, genuinely remarkable. He rode home that evening along the long route through the valley, and he was not thinking about fence lines at all. Through June and into July, the rhythm of the valley included Harriet Bancroft as a matter of fact, which is to say she showed up consistently and behaved consistently, and did what she said she would do, and the territory's particular form of respect, which required proof and not just promise, began to crystallize around her. She came into town twice a week for supplies and mail, and she always stopped at Drummond's store, and Agnes always set aside the things she had ordered and sometimes added something Agnes thought she might need. A sack of lime for the soil, an extra length of rope, a bottle of camphor oil that she pressed on Harriet with the authority of a woman who had watched too many homesteaders get sick from insect bites to leave it to chance. She attended the Methodist church on Sundays, which was the appropriate thing to do in a small territory town, and which she did regardless of her private opinions on the matter, sitting in the third pew on the left with her hands folded, and her attention divided equally between Reverend Moore's sermon and the social intelligence available from observing the congregation. She learned that Earl Drennan controlled more water rights in the valley than any man had the right to, and that 2 smaller ranching families, the Pascals and the Thatchers, had been struggling because of it for the better part of 3 years. She learned that the tension between the larger landowners and the homesteaders was a slow, grinding thing, not dramatic but persistent, wearing away at the smaller operations like water on stone. She learned that Wesley Abbott had navigated this tension with characteristic directness, aligning himself with neither the Drennan faction nor with a grieved complaint, simply holding his ground and his water rights with a quiet stubbornness that Drennan had apparently stopped testing about 2 years ago. She thought about this information in the same way she thought about soil composition data and temperature records, as things that needed to be understood before they could be managed. In July, the creek to the north of her property ran dry as Wesley had predicted, and she began making the walk to the double-A well 3 times a week with her water cart and Dora the mule. This was when she began to know Wesley Abbott in the way that proximity and shared purpose made possible, which was differently and more thoroughly than she had known most people in her well-organized Philadelphia life. He was usually somewhere visible when she arrived at the well, either working in the near fields or coming in from the range, and he would invariably stop whatever he was doing and come help her work the bucket mechanism, which was not strictly necessary as she was perfectly capable of managing it herself, but which she did not discourage because she was beginning to understand that this was how he expressed things he had not found words for yet. They talked while the water cart filled. He told her about the valley in the way that someone who had lived close to a place for years could tell it, not in terms of facts, but in terms of the quality of specific moments. He told her that the best time to see the valley's full length was at first light in October, when the cottonwoods along the creek had turned, and the light came in low from the east. He told her about the winter 3 years ago when the snow had come in November and stayed until March, and how he and his 2 ranch hands, Emilio and Jim, had kept the cattle alive by hauling hay every day in conditions that were essentially impossible, and how that winter had taught him more about what he was made of than anything that had come before. She told him about Philadelphia, not fondly exactly, but with the clear-eyed honesty of someone cataloging a landscape they had left behind. She told him about her father, who had been a civil engineer of genuine skill, and had taught her to read maps and survey lines and understand the physical logic of terrain before she was 12 years old. She told him that he had died when she was 18, and that after his death the trajectory of her life had bent steadily toward other people's visions of what she ought to be until she had almost lost track of her own. "The engagement," Wesley said one afternoon, not as a question exactly. "He was a good man," she said, as she had said before. "His name was Arthur. He was kind and consistent, and he thought I was interesting in the way that men sometimes think complicated women are interesting until they realize they intend to remain complicated indefinitely. He wanted you simpler," Wesley said. "He wanted me settled," she said, "which is not the same thing as simple, but it has some of the same effect." Wesley was quiet for a moment, watching the water pour into the cart barrel. "You are not going to settle," he said, and it was not a criticism. "Not in the way he meant," she said, "but I have settled here. That is a different thing entirely." He looked at her when she said that, and there was something in his expression that was carefully neutral in the way that careful neutrality is always a sign of something being held back. The valley was talking about them already by mid-July. Small towns run on observation and inference, and the twice-weekly presence of Harriet Bancroft at Wesley Abbott's well, combined with his presence at her fence line, his delivery of a load of hay she had not asked for, and he had not announced, but which appeared one morning stacked neatly beside her barn, and his riding beside her into town twice when their trips happened to coincide, was sufficiently observable to generate considerable inference. Agnes Drummond said nothing directly but smiled in a way that communicated everything. Pete Calloway mentioned to Wesley casually that Miss Bancroft's mule had a loose shoe, and that Wesley might want to mention it to her, which was the livery keeper's version of playing Cupid. Mabel Drennan, whose predictions about Harriet's departure had continued not to come true, shifted her commentary from contempt to concern, telling her social circle that someone really ought to speak to Wesley Abbott about the inadvisability of encouraging an unsuitable attachment. Reverend Moore, who was a practical man, simply noted in his diary that the Bancroft parcel was coming along impressively for a first season. In August, Harriet ran into her first serious trouble, and it did not come from the land. Earl Drennan came to see her on a Tuesday morning when she was working in the kitchen garden, a big man of 60 who wore his wealth like weather, naturally, and with the assumption that everything around him would simply accommodate it. He arrived in a good buggy with a hired man driving, and he got down and walked to the edge of her garden with the slow deliberateness of someone accustomed to being met halfway. "Miss Bancroft," he said. "Mr. Drennan," she said, setting down her trowel and standing up straight. She did not go to the edge of the garden to meet him. He looked at the property, and his look was the assessing look of a man calculating acreage and water access and proximity to his own holdings, not the look of someone admiring a neighbor's garden. "You have done well with this parcel," he said. "Better than most expected." "I know," she said. He looked at her then, and she met his eyes steadily, and she understood from this look what the visit was about, though she waited for him to say it. "I would like to buy this land from you," he said. "I will give you a fair price. More than fair, given that you have not yet fully established it. You could return to Philadelphia with money in hand and a story to tell." Harriet looked at him for a long moment. "This land is not for sale," she said. "I am prepared to be generous," he said, as though she had not understood the first time. "I heard you the first time," she said. "The land is not for sale, not at any price, not under any conditions. I did not come here to acquire a story to tell. I came here to build a life, and I am building it." Drennan's expression shifted, not into anger but into the cold stillness of a man who is cataloging a problem for later resolution. "This territory is harder than it looks from the outside," he said. "Harder than you hoped to find it when you rode out here this morning, certainly," she said, "and the edge in it was precise." He got back in his buggy and left without another word. She told Wesley about it that afternoon when she came to the well, not in the manner of a woman frightened and seeking protection, but in the manner of a woman sharing relevant intelligence with a reliable neighbor. She told it factually, as she did most things. Wesley's jaw tightened in a way she was beginning to recognize as the visible surface of anger being consciously managed. "Drennan has been acquiring land in this valley for 15 years by outlasting people," he said. "He does not usually make direct offers. He waits." "Then he is impatient about this parcel," Harriet said. "There is a spring on the northern edge of your property," Wesley said. "I have been meaning to tell you about it. I am not certain it is accessible from the surface, but the geological signs are there. If there is water underneath that ground, your parcel is worth considerably more than what Drennan offered, and it would make you independent of my well in the dry months." She looked at him. "How long have you been thinking about this spring?" "Since you first mentioned the apple orchard," he said. "The soil composition in that area is different from the alkali sections, and last winter I noticed the ground there held moisture longer than it should have. I did not want to mention it until I was more certain because I did not want to raise a hope I could not confirm." The consideration in that, the deliberate care of it, the fact that he had been holding information not to withhold it but to protect her from disappointment, settled into her chest with a warmth she acknowledged privately and immediately. "Can we find it?" she asked. "I know a man," he said. The man he knew was Tomás Reyes, who was 67 years old and had been finding water in New Mexico territory for 40 years through a combination of geological knowledge, practical experience, and an intuitive relationship with the land that he described, when he described it at all, as simply listening. He was a small, wiry man with a deeply lined face who had been born in the territory when it was still Mexican land, and who had lived through changes that would have broken a lesser spirit: the war, the treaty, the slow territorial absorption, the steady displacement of the people and systems he had grown up with, and who had arrived at his current age with a quietness that was not resignation, but something more like the profound acceptance of someone who had decided to persist. He came out to the parcel on a Thursday morning and walked the northern section for 2 hours, stopping at intervals, kneeling to press his palm to the ground, watching the slope of the terrain with focused attention. Harriet walked with him and said nothing, which Wesley noted was the correct approach, as Tamaz worked better without commentary. At the end of 2 hours, Tamaz stopped at a point about 60 yards northeast of the orchard stakes and said, "Here." They dug. It took 3 days, with Wesley and his ranch hand Emilio taking turns on the long-handled shovels, going down 12 feet before the ground changed texture, and then, on the 14th foot, there was water. Harriet stood at the edge of the hole and watched the water seep up through the cleared earth and fill the lower portion of the shaft, dark and clear. And she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel since she arrived, which was the relief of confirmation, the validation of a gamble, the sense that the ground beneath her had been keeping a promise she had half believed it would keep. She paid Tamaz Rays what he asked for his time and added enough to it that he looked at her with a brief sharp assessment that resolved into something that might have been respect. "Your orchard will do well," he told her in accented English. "This is good ground. It just needed to be asked properly." After Tamaz left, Wesley and Harriet stood beside the new well in the afternoon light, and neither of them spoke for a long time, and then Wesley said quietly, "You were right about this place." "I researched carefully," she said, but her voice was softer than usual. "I told you it was no place for someone like you," he said, "that first morning." "You did," she said. "I was wrong," he said. "I did not know what kind of person you were. I made an assumption that was not based on anything real." She looked at him sideways. "You have been useful regardless of the assumption," she said. "That is not quite an absolution," he said. "It was not meant to be," she said, but she was smiling. They were standing close enough together that she was aware of him in the particular physical way that she had been carefully not acknowledging for several weeks. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized now, the careful neutrality over something that wanted very much to be less neutral, and she thought, clearly and without drama, that if he did not say something soon she was going to have to say it herself, which she was prepared to do. He turned to look at her fully. "Miss Bancroft," he started. "Harriet," she said. He absorbed this. "Harriet," he said, and the way he said it the first time was careful and warm together. "I would like to call on you properly. If you are willing." "I have been wondering what was taking you so long," she said. He laughed, genuinely and without reservation, and it was the first time she had heard him do that, a real laugh without any management in it, and she thought that it was, without exaggeration, one of the finest sounds she had heard in a considerable while. He called on her that Sunday after church, and they walked the property together in the way that was their natural mode of being together, moving through the landscape with a shared attention to it that felt more intimate than parlor conversation would have been. He brought her a cutting from an apple tree he had seen growing wild in the northern hills, wrapped in wet cloth to protect the roots, saying that he could not promise it would take, but that it would be a start. She planted it the following morning where the well now stood, and she thought about the fact that it was September already, and that the first frost would come in October, maybe late October if they were lucky, and that she had not yet lost the gamble she had come west to make. September in Coldwater Flats was busy with the preparations for winter, the sealing of walls against wind, the laying in of provisions, the sorting and storing of the season's produce. Harriet had her kitchen garden harvested, the vegetables stored in the cellar she had dug in August, the goats relocated to the improved shed beside the house. She had enough to see her through a normal winter, maybe not comfortably but adequately, which was what the first year was supposed to produce. Wesley was present through these preparations in an increasing way, coming over on weekend afternoons and sometimes on weekday evenings, and the relationship between them deepened in the quiet, steady way of two people who are genuinely interested in each other past the initial attraction. They talked about everything. He told her about his family in Missouri. his father who had been a farmer and his mother who had died when Wesley was 16, and whose death had sent him west at 18 with no very definite plan except forward. She told him about her mother, who was still living in Philadelphia with her older sister's family, and who had written 3 letters about the Western enterprise ranging from resigned acceptance to cautious hope. She told him about her father's engineering work, about the hours she had spent as a child watching him draw plans, about the way he had taught her to read a landscape as a system rather than a surface. They agreed on very little politically and almost everything practically, which was, she thought, a more interesting and useful combination than the reverse. He was sitting at her kitchen table one October evening when she showed him the letter she had received from the New Mexico Agricultural Society, responding to the paper she had submitted to them in August describing her soil analysis methodology and the discovery of the subsurface spring. The letter was from the Society's secretary, and it said that her paper was the most methodologically rigorous submission they had received from a private homesteader in 3 years of publication, and that they would be honored to include it in their autumn journal. Wesley read the letter twice. "You wrote a scientific paper about your soil," he said. "About the relationship between soil composition, topographic position, and subsurface water accessibility in the eastern Coldwater Valley," she said, correcting him precisely. He set the letter down and looked at her across the table with an expression that had moved entirely past careful neutrality into something unguarded and warm. "Harriet," he said. "Wesley," she said. "I am entirely in love with you," he said. "I thought you should know." She looked at him for a moment with the steady gray eyes that had catalogued him from the first morning, and then she said, "I know. I have known for about 2 months. I was waiting for you to arrive at it on your own terms." "That is infuriating," he said. "You needed the time," she said. "You are a thorough person." He got up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and took her face in both his hands, and kissed her for the first time there in her kitchen, with the lamp burning low and the first edges of October wind pressing at the new roof boards. And it was, she would think later, exactly right in the way that only things that have been properly prepared for can be. The whole valley had something to say about it, of course. Agnes Drummond said, "About time," to both of them separately and with equal satisfaction. Pete Calloway offered Wesley his congratulations with the self-satisfied air of a man who had seen it coming. Reverend Moore noted in his diary that the courtship between Mr. Abbott and Miss Bancroft had concluded satisfactorily, and that he anticipated a formal announcement before winter. Mabel Drennan said nothing for a full week, which was remarkable, and then said that she supposed Miss Bancroft had known what she was about all along, which for Mabel was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The one development that was not warm occurred in mid-October, when Earl Drennan made a second approach, this one less direct. 3 of the fence stakes on the western boundary of Harriet's property were pulled up and relocated 6 feet east, a small deliberate adjustment that would, if formalized in the land records, shift a strip of her prime kitchen garden soil onto his adjacent parcel. It was the kind of incremental pressure that Drennan was known to apply, small enough to be deniable, large enough to be meaningful. Wesley found the stakes on a morning ride and came directly to Harriet, who looked at the relocated markers with a quiet, focused anger and said, "I need to speak to the land office." "I will come with you," Wesley said. "I can manage the land office myself," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I would like to come with you." She looked at him and understood the distinction he was making, which was not between her capability and his intervention, but between her going alone and them going together as people who were building something shared, and she nodded. They went to the land office together, and Gideon Marsh, to his considerable credit, took the complaint with total seriousness, went out to the property himself the following day with the original survey records, confirmed the tampering, and filed a formal record of the violation with the territorial authority. Drennan received a formal notice within the week. Whether it was the official notice or something else, Wesley rode to the Drennan ranch the following Saturday and had a conversation he did not describe in detail to Harriet afterward, except to say that he had made clear to Drennan that any further interference with the Bancroft parcel would be answered firmly, and that Drennan had appeared to understand him. "What does firmly mean?" Harriet asked. "Legal means primarily," Wesley said. "Drennan is a practical man. He does not like entanglement with territorial authority, and I have somewhat more experience with that than he has bargained on." She looked at him. "You were the water rights dispute," she said, because she had heard about it from Agnes without the full details, and now the details were filling in. "I filed a federal complaint over Drennan's appropriation of the Eastern Creek rights 2 years ago," Wesley said. "It took 18 months, but the ruling came down in my favor and set a precedent that Drennan has been careful around ever since. You know how to navigate the territorial legal system," she said. "I am thorough," he said, and he said it back to her the way she had said it to him, which made her laugh. There was no further interference from Drennan. The first frost came on the 28th of October. Harriet woke before dawn and went outside and stood in the cold gray light before sunrise and looked at the thin silver coating of frost on every surface of her land, the garden, the stone walls, the ground of what would be the orchard, the young apple cutting standing small and solitary in the circle of stones she had built around it to protect its roots. The frost meant she had made it through the first growing season. It meant she had been here since May and had not broken. It meant the well was dug and the roof was solid and the cellar was full, and the first year, the brutal one, the one Agnes had warned her about, was transitioning into winter with the parcel intact and the orchard planned and the whole valley talking. She stood there in the cold, clear morning and felt something she did not immediately have a word for, and then found it. She felt arrived. Wesley rode over that morning, as she had somewhat expected he would, and came to stand beside her at the edge of the orchard plot. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cold air, and he looked out at the frost-silvered stakes with the same expression he had been getting, she noted, every time he looked at something she had done or made or decided, a kind of wondering respect that she did not think he was entirely conscious of. "First frost," he said. "First frost," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it properly, and I need you to know that I have thought about this carefully, and not just because it is October and I am feeling sentimental about frost." She turned to look at him. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring which was simple and silver, a small band with a single dark stone that caught the pale morning light, and he held it in his palm and looked at her with dark brown eyes that were entirely unguarded. "Harriet," he said, "I would like to spend my life understanding you if you will let me. I know you do not need a partner to survive out here. You have proven that thoroughly. But I would very much like to be your partner anyway. Will you marry me?" She looked at him and at the ring and at the frost-covered ground of the valley that had become hers, and at the man who had ridden the long route home 3 times and brought an apple cutting wrapped in wet cloth and said she was right about this place. And she said, "Yes," with a steadiness and a warmth that she meant entirely. He put the ring on her finger. It fit, because he had measured her ring finger against a piece of string he had gotten from Agnes Drummond under the pretense of needing cord for a fence repair, which Agnes had told him with a perfectly straight face was a completely normal use of string. He kissed her again in the cold October air, and the frost did not melt, but they were warm enough regardless. They were married in the Coldwater Flats Methodist Church on the 20th of November, 1883, in a ceremony that was attended by essentially the entire valley, because essentially the entire valley was invested in this outcome, and no one intended to miss it. Agnes Drummond sat in the front pew with her husband Rufus, and cried with the contained efficiency of a woman who had decided exactly how much emotion was appropriate, and was deploying it precisely. Tamaz Rays sat in the 5th pew and wore a good hat. Emilio and Jim from the Double A sat together in the 7th row, and looked uncomfortable in their pressed shirts and deeply pleased about everything. Even Pete Calloway had cleaned his boots for the occasion. Harriet wore a dress she had made herself from ivory wool she had ordered from Albuquerque in October, simple and well-fitted, with her dark hair down in a way she almost never wore it, and she walked down the aisle of that small frontier church with the direct, unassuming bearing that was simply who she was, not performing composure but genuinely composed. And Wesley, who was standing at the front with Reverend Moore, watched her come to him with an expression on his face that no one in that church would ever forget, because it was so completely plain and honest in its happiness. They said the vows that Reverend Moore read to them, and added a few of their own quietly, at a volume meant only for each other, and Harriet's was this: "I came west looking for the right life, and I found it here, which is partly this land and mostly you." And Wesley's was this: "I told you this was no place for someone like you, and I was wrong about that, and I intend to keep being shown how wrong I was for as long as you will let me." The Valley talked about it for the rest of the year, which brought them to a comfortable, agreed-upon conclusion. The winter frost had come, and before it came, everything had changed. They settled into the life of two people who had chosen each other with care and intention, which was a different and more stable foundation than most marriages managed. They spent the first winter in Harriet's house on the parcel, which was smaller than the AA but was Harriet's, and this mattered to both of them in ways they articulated only slowly over time. They managed the two properties as a shared operation from the start, which was practically sensible and also philosophically important to Harriet, who did not want her enterprise absorbed into Wesley's but integrated with it. They talked about everything, as they always had, and they disagreed about several things productively, and the only real argument of that first winter was about the routing of the new access road from the parcel to the main valley track, which Wesley thought should go northwest to join his existing road and Harriet thought should go due north to cross the creek and have a separate approach entirely. They argued about it for a week with detailed reference to maps and terrain data and the probable location of future orchard rows, and ultimately built it the north route because Harriet's reasoning about the orchard access was correct, which Wesley acknowledged directly, and which Harriet did not belabor. In the spring of 1884, they broke ground on a proper house on the parcel. Wesley designed the structure, which was more ambitious than she had originally planned, a house of 4 rooms with a proper kitchen and a stone fireplace in the main room and a porch facing west toward the hills, because Wesley had told her about the light in that direction in October, and she had decided she wanted a porch from which to see it. They built it through spring and into summer with Cobb and Sela's farmers' help, and by August it was standing and they moved in. Harriet planted the orchard that spring. 12 apple trees, of a variety she had corresponded extensively with an orchard in Colorado to obtain, chosen for cold hardiness and soil adaptability, arranged in the pattern she had staked out the previous year with string and posts. They were small and bare when she put them in the ground, and she stood back and looked at the row of bare sticks and thought about the woman she would be in 5 years when these trees bore fruit. She submitted a second paper to the New Mexico Agricultural Society in April, this one about subsurface water discovery methods based on Tomás Reyes's techniques combined with her own soil analysis methodology. The Society not only published it, but invited her to present it at their annual meeting in Santa Fe in September. She went, with Wesley beside her, and stood in front of a room of 50 farmers and surveyors and academics, and presented her findings in a clear, methodical voice, and answered questions for 40 minutes afterward, and received a formal commendation from the Society's president. Wesley sat in the audience and watched her with the expression she had first seen on the orchard ground in October, and which she saw regularly now, and which she had decided was one of her favorite things in the world. On the ride back from Santa Fe he said, "You are extraordinary." "I am thorough," she said. "That is the same thing in your case," he said. They knew by November that she was expecting their first child, which became the source of considerable excitement in both households, and which Agnes Drummond greeted by immediately producing from some back shelf of Drummond's store an enormous quantity of soft flannel in several colors that she claimed she had ordered speculatively for just such an occasion. "Agnes," Harriet said, holding the flannel and laughing, "I filed on that land in May of last year." "I am an optimistic woman," Agnes said. The child was born in July of 1885, a boy they named Daniel Thomas Abbott, the Thomas for Tamaz Rays who had found their water, and whose contribution to the whole enterprise felt to both of them significant enough to honor. He was a healthy, loud, insistent child with Harriet's gray eyes and Wesley's dark hair, and he immediately commanded the full attention of everyone around him with the same direct force of personality that seemed to run in the family. Tamaz Rays came to see the baby and sat with him for a long, quiet moment and said, "He will know this land," which Harriet took as the highest possible blessing. Mabel Drennan, who had by this time entirely revised her early assessments, sent a gift, a small silver cup engraved with the child's initials, which was gracious enough that Harriet accepted it graciously in return. And after that the two women were not exactly friends but were entirely civil, which was as much as either of them needed. Earl Drennan had not made any further moves on the Bancroft parcel. Wesley's federal water rights precedent held, and the formal notice over the fence stakes had apparently settled the calculation. Drennan was growing older, and the next generation of his family, his son Robert, was a different sort of man, more inclined to cooperation than acquisition, and as Robert took more of the ranch management onto his own shoulders, the atmosphere of the valley's landowner relations warmed perceptibly. The apple trees grew. This is the thing about orchards. They are an act of optimism extended over years. Harriet tended them through 1885 and 1886 with the same systematic attention she gave everything, noting their annual growth, testing the soil around their roots, managing the water carefully through the dry months, protecting the young bark from deer in winter with careful wrapping. The Double A's expanded operation now included a small formal partnership with the Bancroft parcel that ran on paper and in practice as an integrated whole, but the orchard was entirely Harriet's enterprise and everyone in the valley knew it. In 1887, the oldest 3 trees bloomed for the first time. She was in the kitchen when Wesley came in from the orchard plot in late April with an expression she did not immediately understand, something between excited and moved, and he said, "Come outside." She came outside. The 3 oldest trees were covered in white blossoms, small and thick and impossibly fragrant against the blue April sky, and she stood at the edge of the orchard and looked at them for a long time without speaking. 3 years she had tended these trees from bare sticks. 3 years they had been a plan and a set of stakes, and then small hopeful saplings, and then larger saplings, and now this. "Oh," she said softly. "Yes," Wesley said beside her. She took his hand and held it, and they stood in the orchard of her making while the blossoms stirred in the morning air. And Daniel, who was nearly 2 and walking with the exploratory determination of a small person who has recently discovered legs, came tottering through the grass toward them, making the sound he made when he was interested in something. Wesley scooped the boy up and settled him on his hip, and Daniel grabbed a handful of his father's collar and stared at the flowers with his mother's gray eyes going wide. Agnes Drummond came out to see the blossoms the following Sunday after church, along with what felt like half the town, because the news had traveled as all news traveled in Coldwater Flats, thoroughly and quickly. People walked through the young orchard with their Sunday clothes on and looked at the white flowers and talked to Harriet about how she had managed it, and she explained patiently about the soil treatment and the water management and the specific varieties' cold tolerance. And people listened with the genuine attention of people whose lives depended on understanding the land. And the whole afternoon had the quality of a celebration that was larger than just the blooms. but was actually about what the blooms meant, which was that the bet had paid, the gamble had held, the work had been right. The first harvest came in October of 1887, modest by any formal orchard standard but extraordinary in its context, the first orchard fruit grown in the eastern Coldwater Valley. Harriet picked the apples herself, with Wesley and Daniel beside her, and she brought a portion of them to the Methodist church for the harvest gathering and set them on the table with the other offered produce. And Reverend Moore held one up and said he would remember the day Harriet Bancroft's orchard bore fruit as long as he lived. The apples were, everyone agreed, exceptional. She sent a box of them to the New Mexico Agricultural Society with a note describing the cultivation method and the yield data. The Society's response came in November and included a formal request for her to contribute to a new agricultural guide they were compiling for territory homesteaders. She agreed immediately. Through 1888, she worked on the guide alongside the orchard and the household and Daniel, who was growing fast and had developed an intense interest in the livestock that kept him close to the barn and occasionally inside it when he was supposed to be elsewhere. Wesley had taught him to ride before he was 3, on a very patient old mare named Clara, and the boy had taken to it with an enthusiasm that suggested the territory had gotten under his blood in the way it gets under the blood of children born to it. The second pregnancy they knew about in early 1888, which made Agnes produce another quantity of flannel with the same air of strategic patience, and in September of 1888 their daughter arrived, Margaret Ellen Abbott, named for Wesley's mother and for Harriet's grandmother, a small fierce girl with reddish hair that neither of them had accounted for, and which seemed to be operating on its own program entirely. She was different from Daniel in the way that second children announced themselves, with a quiet intensity that resolved very early into clear preferences and clear refusals, and she was entirely devoted to the apple trees from the first spring she was old enough to be carried into the orchard. "She knows what this place is," Harriet said one afternoon, watching Margaret sitting in the grass between 2 trees with the focused attention of a very small person doing something important. "She takes after her mother," Wesley said. "She takes after herself," Harriet said, which was also something she said about herself, and Wesley understood it the same way both times. The Agricultural Guide was published by the New Mexico Territorial Press in the spring of 1889, credited to the New Mexico Agricultural Society, with a contributor acknowledgement that listed H. Abbott, formerly H. Bancroft, as the primary author of the water access and soil analysis sections. Agnes Drummond displayed 3 copies in the front window of Drummond's General Store, with a small card that said simply, "Our neighbor wrote this," and they sold out within a week to farmers across the territory who wanted to understand their land better. Emilio, who had worked the AA for 5 years and had recently married a woman named Rosario from the southern part of the territory, told Wesley with absolute seriousness that Mrs. Abbott's water section had saved his new father-in-law's south field from a second dry year, because the old man had used her methodology to locate a subsurface source he had not known was there. "You should tell her that," Wesley said. "I already did," Emilio said. She took the information down in her notebook. Wesley laughed. Of course she did. The valley had been talking about Harriet Bancroft, who had become Harriet Abbott without becoming anyone other than herself, for 6 years now. It was not the kind of talking that stopped, because she gave it new material regularly. It was the kind of talking that settled over time into the bedrock of a place's self-understanding, into the stories that people told as examples when they wanted to illustrate something true. The story of the woman who had come off the stagecoach with 2 leather trunks and filed on the Harlow parcel before anyone realized she was serious was told in the territory in the way that foundational stories are told, with the pleasure of a story whose ending is good. On the 6th anniversary of her filing on the parcel, Wesley took her out to the orchard at sunset on a May evening, and they stood together between the trees, which were full and established now, their third year of bearing, and he put his arms around her from behind, and they looked at what she had built. The house was solid and warm and contained their children and their books and their carefully organized life. The well was good. The kitchen garden had expanded to a proper working garden. The goat herd had grown and diversified. The orchard had 12 trees bearing fruit and was about to expand by 8 more, which would make the Bancroft parcel, which was still called the Bancroft parcel by everyone in the valley regardless of the change in Harriet's surname, the largest private orchard in the Eastern Territory. "Do you remember," Wesley said, "what I said to you that first morning? You said this territory was no place for someone like me," she said. "I was trying to protect something," he said. "I think I was trying to protect the idea of you. I had not met you yet, and I was already concerned about you. You were concerned about a woman you had not met based on Pete Calloway's description of her," Harriet said. "Pete said you were pretty and went straight to the land office," Wesley said. "That combination seemed impractical and I was worried." "It is a very good combination," she said. "It is the best combination," he said, and kissed her hair. "I have revised my position entirely." "I noticed," she said. The evening light came across the valley in the particular October-adjacent quality that she had learned and loved, golden and long and full of the day's ending warmth, and the orchard caught it and held it in the way orchards hold light, storing it in leaves and bark, giving it back slowly. "I want to expand the operation next spring," she said. "Not just the orchard. I have been corresponding with a woman in Colorado who is running a cooperative canning operation with 3 other farms, and I think something similar could work here. If I had 8 or 10 additional apple trees, and the Pascals and the Thatchers were willing to contribute their fruit crops, we could run a cooperative under the Agricultural Society's guidance, and everyone's yields would have a more consistent market." Wesley was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You are already planning this." "I have been planning it for about 3 months," she said. "Have you spoken to the Pascals and the Thatchers?" "Not formally. But Martha Pascal mentioned at church last month that their apple yield had no reliable buyer, and I suggested I might have a proposal for her. She was interested." "Harriet," he said. "Wesley," she said. "Do you ever stop planning?" he asked, not with fatigue but with genuine affectionate wonder. "When I am asleep," she said. "Sometimes." He laughed, that real unmanaged laugh that she had first heard the night she told him she had known he was in love with her for 2 months, and she thought it again as she always thought it, that it was one of the finest sounds she had ever heard, this specific laugh, this man's laugh, here in the evening orchard of her making. "Do it," he said. "All of it. Every piece of it. I will do whatever you need." "I know," she said. "I have always known that about you." They walked back to the house as the light went and the first stars came out over the valley. And inside, Daniel was at the kitchen table doing the arithmetic that Wesley had set him before going out. And Margaret was sitting beside him, offering commentary on the numbers that was not strictly requested, but was apparently comprehensive. And the house was warm and bright in the cooling evening. And Harriet stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at all of it. The cooperative did form in the spring of 1890. Harriet organized it with Martha Pascal and a woman named Grace Thatcher, who turned out to have a gift for the logistics of the canning operation that surprised even her own husband. And by the first autumn harvest of that year, the Coldwater Valley Fruit Cooperative was running out of a building they had built on the south end of the main street. And the valley's fruit producers had a market that was stable and fair and run by people who understood both the farming and the commerce. The New Mexico Agricultural Society sent a representative to visit in October of 1890. A young man from Santa Fe named Harper who had read Harriet's contributions to the guide and wanted to see the operation in person. He arrived expecting, Harriet suspected, to be politely impressive to a farm wife, and he spent 3 hours being comprehensively educated about cooperative structure, soil science, water management, and the economics of small-scale fruit production, and left with 6 pages of notes and the expression of a man who has realized the world is larger than his previous map of it. "You should consider a position with the society," he told her. "I have a position," she said. "Is here." She meant it, and he understood that she meant it, and the conversation moved on. The orchard bore 28 bushels that autumn. Wesley was present for the harvest, as he was present for almost everything, not in the way of a man managing his wife's enterprise, but in the way of a man who considers his wife's enterprise as his own because her life is his life, and has been since he sat down uninvited on the stone wall beside her in June of 1883 and asked what she was writing. He picked apples alongside Harriet and Daniel and little Margaret, who was more hindrance than help, but whose enthusiasm was significant. And Emilio and Jim and Rosario all came to help and stayed for the evening meal that Harriet and Rosario made together. And it was loud and warm and full, the house holding all of them easily because they had built it with that in mind. After the children were in bed and the ranch hands had gone home, Wesley and Harriet sat on the western porch in the cool October dark with cups of coffee, and the quiet around them that was not empty quiet but full quiet, the kind that accumulates in a life that has been well lived. "Gideon Marsh told me today," Wesley said, "that you are the most talked about person in the territory south of Santa Fe." "Gideon Marsh is not a reliable source on most things," Harriet said. "He is on this one," Wesley said. "I confirmed it with 3 other people." She smiled, looking at the dark hills to the west. "They said I would leave before winter," she said. "The first winter." "Most of them," he agreed. "I did not say you would leave. I said it was no place for you." "Same prediction," she said. "Different reason," he said. "They thought you could not manage it. I thought it would not be enough for you, that you would manage it and find it insufficient." She turned to look at him. This was a distinction she had not heard him draw before, and it was precise enough to be surprising. "You thought I would outgrow it," she said. "I thought a woman who had done what you had done in Philadelphia, ended an engagement, educated herself, made a formal plan, crossed the country alone. I thought that woman might find a hardscrabble homestead in New Mexico territory too small," he said. "That it might be a step on the way to something else rather than the destination itself." She considered this for a moment. "And now, he said, "I think you understood something from the beginning that it took me longer to see, which is that small is not the same as insufficient. That a valley and an orchard and 2 children and a cooperative and a paper in the Agricultural Society Journal is not small at all. That it is, in fact, the size of a full life, a complete one." She reached across and took his hand where it rested on the arm of his chair. "Wesley," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are one of the best thinkers I have ever known," she said, "and you took 6 years to tell me that." "I was being thorough," he said. The stars over Coldwater Valley were extraordinary on clear October nights, brilliant and unreduced by any competing light, the Milky Way visible in full from horizon to horizon across the dark sky. Harriet had tried to describe them in letters to her mother, who had come to visit the previous summer and had stood outside on the first night and looked up and said nothing for a long time, which was unusual for Harriet's mother, and then said, "Oh, I see. I see why you stayed." Her mother had gone back to Philadelphia with 3 jars of orchard jam and a different understanding of her daughter's life. She had written monthly since then instead of the previous quarterly, and her letters had changed in tone, not into approval exactly, because Harriet had never needed her mother's approval and her mother had never entirely offered it, but into something more like genuine respect, which was better. The second apple cutting Wesley had brought her was now a proper tree, the largest in the orchard, standing near the well where she had planted it in October of 1883. She had not told him for some time that she thought of it as the most important tree in the orchard, not because of any practical quality, but because of when he had brought it, wrapped in wet cloth, before he had said the word love, when he was only just beginning to understand what he was doing, and the tree had grown from that beginning into something full and productive and permanent, which seemed right. In the autumn of 1891, she became pregnant for the 3rd time, which surprised neither of them but delighted both. This child came in May of 1892, Another boy, named Robert James Abbott, and he was born in the house Harriet had built on the land she had claimed on a Tuesday afternoon in May of 1883, delivered by the doctor who had come out from town in the early morning. And when it was done and the baby was placed in her arms, she lay in the bed in the room with the window facing east and watched the May light come through the glass. The same kind of glass she had ordered from Drummond's store in her first month in the territory, and had an old window frame replaced with. And the light was the same clear gold of every morning here that she had catalogued in her notebook from the first week. Wesley came in and sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at his new son with an expression that she recognized from the first time, the same open, unguarded tenderness that fatherhood had produced in him without diminishment, and that she thought was one of the truest things she knew about him, that he had entirely room for more. "Another Abbott for the valley," she said. "Another Bancroft more like," he said. "He has your eyes." She looked at the baby, who was indeed looking at the world with clear gray eyes of focused assessment. "He will have to develop his own approach," she said. "I expect he will," Wesley said. Daniel was 7 by this time, a serious, purposeful boy who had already decided he was going to be a surveyor when he grew up, and who accompanied Harriet on her soil analysis walks whenever she permitted it and asked questions that she answered in full, because he was capable of understanding the full answers, and it would have been disrespectful not to give them. Margaret was 4, and her character had not simplified with age, only deepened, and she had a particular relationship with the orchard that expressed itself as a kind of ownership she had never been explicitly granted, but that everyone recognized anyway. The cooperative had its third successful season in 1892 and had added 2 more farms to its membership, and Grace Thatcher had developed a preserves line that was selling in Albuquerque and had been requested by a grocery concern in Santa Fe, which made the enterprise genuinely commercial rather than merely practical. Harriet sat at the kitchen table one evening that autumn writing the year's report for the Agricultural Society, and looked up to find Wesley watching her from the doorway with a cup of coffee in each hand and a small smile that was entirely private and entirely for her. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He came in and set one of the cups beside her and sat across the table, the same chairs, as the evening 3 years before when he had read the letter from the society and said he was entirely in love with her. "I am thinking," he said, "about the morning you stepped off that stagecoach. Pete Calloway told me about a pretty woman who went straight to the land office, and I rode by your parcel twice in the next week and told myself it was about the fence line." "It was not about the fence line," she said. "It was not remotely about the fence line," he agreed. "I was completely turned around before I had spoken to you once, and the first thing I told you was that you did not belong here." "You were wrong," she said. "I was catastrophically wrong," he said. "You belonged here before I did in the way that matters, in the way where the place becomes real because the right person decides to claim it." She looked at him over the pages of her report, and the lamp between them caught the warm brown of his eyes, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had done the best work of her life not in the orchard or the cooperative or the agricultural guide, but simply in recognizing from that first afternoon on the stone wall that this man was worth the time. "Come here," she said. He came around the table and she stood up and he put his arms around her, and they stood in their kitchen with 3 children sleeping in the rooms above them, and the valley quiet outside and the orchard silver in the October moonlight through the window, and it was complete, she thought. Not in the sense of finished, because there was always more to do and she intended to keep doing it, but complete in the sense of whole, containing everything it was supposed to contain. "You should know," she said against his shoulder, "that I am planning the orchard expansion for next spring. 6 more trees. I want to try the northern variety from the Colorado operation." "Of course you are," he said, with the laugh in his voice. "And I have been corresponding with the agricultural department at the University of New Mexico about an irrigation methodology study for the valley," she said. They want to use our well data. Harriet, he said. Yes, she said. I love you comprehensively, he said. Every piece of this, every plan and every notebook and every paper and every apple. I know, she said. I have known for years, and I love you the same way. The frost came again in late October, as it always did, silvering the valley and the orchard and the stone wall that was the first thing she had stood beside when she arrived here. And the whole territory lay quiet and cold and beautiful under the clear high sky. And Harriet Bancroft Abbott's land held the frost the way it held the seasons, all of them, honestly and without flinching, and waited for spring. Some years later, when Daniel was grown and had indeed become a surveyor and was working out of Santa Fe, and Margaret had married a rancher from the north end of the valley, and was running her own section of it with the same focused authority she had always had, and Robert was old enough to help with the orchard harvest in a way that was genuinely useful and not just enthusiastic, and the cooperative was the most successful small agricultural enterprise in the Eastern Territory. And Harriet's name appeared in 3 published agricultural guides, and on a formal commendation from the New Mexico Territorial Authority for contributions to frontier homesteading methodology. Wesley Abbott stood on the western porch on an October evening, watching the light come across the valley, and thought about the first morning. He had told her the territory was no place for someone like her. She had had the whole valley talking before the first frost. And then she had built an orchard, and a cooperative, and a life, and a family, and a reputation that extended across the territory. And she had done it all from a parcel that Gideon Marsh had described as rough country with no surface water and an alkali soil problem. And she had done it because she was the kind of person who read every territorial survey available in Philadelphia before she came, who took temperature readings every morning and evening from her first day, who cataloged soil types and light angles and seasonal creek patterns, who went straight to the land office while her trunks were still on the boardwalk. The kind of person she was, it turned out, was exactly the kind of person this place needed. Harriet came out to the porch with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside him looking at the valley, and she put her hand through his arm and he covered it with his own, and the light came in low and gold over the cottonwoods in the orchard, and below them the frost-edged valley stretched away to the hills, belonging in the deepest sense of that word to everyone who had built something real in it, and to Harriet Bancroft most of all. The northern variety trees are putting on good growth, she said. They are, he agreed. I think we will have a full yield next autumn, she said. I think you are right, he said. I usually am, she said, and he laughed, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the valley held them as it always had, as it always would.